To a new edition of the Shinsei Fitness Show, where we talk about everything related to your health, your fitness, your well-being. Developing the fitness mindset. In this segment, I want to talk about the interrelationship and the connection between fitness and Bushido. As I've talked about on this segment, or in previous segments on this show and at the shinseimethod.com, as well as the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, we talk about the application of the idea and the concept of principle, life principle, to the application of various areas of business and life. Fitness is an important aspect of life. Fitness is an important aspect of my life personally. I've been training in martial arts and Bushido for decades. I started really in competitive powerlifting in terms of fitness. Well, actually at 13 I started in running for weight loss when I was 13. And then from there, when I was still in high school and then throughout college, weight training, progressed to competitive powerlifting, continued with self-defense Bushido. Now the reason I want to talk about Bushido and this idea of establishing the mental mindset is because in many fitness magazines and many gyms, you don't hear a lot of talk about mindset, establishing the mindset. Most of the time, particularly in America, the emphasis is on getting psyched out or getting into what they call the zone. Now that's a very important concept. In Bushido, we talk about Mushin, or I like the concept Makoto. Sometimes Mushin is translated to mean the state of no mind, and it's really a misleading translation. It does have some application. I like to understand that concept in terms of the quiet mind or the intuitive mind. In the West, we like to talk about second nature. That's what really Mushin is. Mushin, and I think the reason it's translated to mean no mind is because it's the state of mental existence where you are not consciously thinking about anything in particular. So then you ask yourself, well, how is that possible? How can I do something if I'm not thinking about it? I like to use the example of typing or driving for people who are over 18, let's say. And if you have been driving for a while, I have been driving since I was about 16 or 17. I started out by going to driver's education class and then learning how to drive that way in a more systematic way, because I believe in safety, particularly in driving. And it has a direct bearing on this idea of mindset, because when you're driving, one of the most effective ways you have to control driving, because you can't control what other people are doing, and if you live in any major metropolitan area, there's a lot of crazy people on the road, and a lot of them don't obey traffic signs and safety practices. And in many cities, like Los Angeles as an example, the people are coming and going from all different areas. It is not uncommon for you to be driving on the freeway in Los Angeles, for example, and see a sink, or in one case, a dead body. People are just continuing to drive as if there's nothing going on. Mattresses, you often see on the freeway. Well, a lot of people often also drive very fast on the freeway. But one of the most effective ways that you have in driving to control safety, or at least to have some control over safety and risk minimization in your own personal situation, is speed. If you slow your speed and go slower, you have more control over what you can do, you have more control over your reaction time, and you have more control over what you do. So that's one example. But how do you do that? How do you implement this idea of speed when you're on the freeway? Do you consciously think about it? Well, of course you don't. You think about it in terms of letting your foot off the gas, but when you let your foot off the gas, you don't specifically think, I'm going to let my foot off the gas right now. You just let your foot off the gas. There's no really conscious deliberation of that. That's Mushin. If you think about it from another perspective, when you're driving, most of the time when you're driving, you're not consciously thinking, I'm going to hold the steering wheel. You just hold the steering wheel. Now, it's not like you're no mind. Of course, you're paying attention to what's going on. You're looking around. You're alert. And in fact, if you're in the heightened state of concentration, which I advocate, because whenever you want to accomplish anything, and this is a very good example, if you want to accomplish safety and risk minimization, one of the important ways to do that is to focus and concentrate. Well, how do you focus and concentrate without consciously thinking about, I'm going to focus and concentrate. If you're thinking about I'm going to focus and concentrate, you're not focusing and concentrating because you're really thinking about that. It's like a metacognition, sometimes called, because you're thinking about thinking. Now that's a good thing to do sometimes, but in this case not so much, because what you're trying to do is get to the point where you are in a complete state where everything else is tuned out and you're only engrossed in what you are consciously doing. Now that's a total commitment in terms of mental commitment. That's total concentration. In many social settings, that tends not to be advocated, but that's really what you need if you want to drive safely, if you want to accomplish something. It really requires, sometimes if you want to accomplish something over a period of time, it requires that dedication to concentrated effort over an extended period. Now that doesn't mean that you're doing it 24 hours a day, but there may be a block of time that you cut out where you are in total concentration in order to pick up where you left off the previous day. Writing a novel, for example, I'm a writer, so if I'm writing, that's one of the ways that you can accomplish something over a long period of time, a major project, by focusing on a particular time every day where you are going to become engrossed in that activity. Now, I just gave you two examples of Mushin and how it applies to everyday life. That's really what Mushin is. Typing is another example. If you're typing and if you have any speed in typing, let's say 50 words a minute, you're not, when you first learn typing, you have to look at where the keys are located. But after you gain a certain level of practice, you get a sensory, tactile sense of where those keys are, and you don't have to look at the keyboard anymore. Now, does that mean that you're not thinking about typing? Well, yes and no. I mean, you are thinking about typing because you're typing. You're thinking about what you're doing, really, is what you're doing. But because you have routinized and made intuitive and made that act of typing second nature through practice. So one of the key aspects of that, of course, is practice over a period of time. In the Japanese martial arts, it's also called kata. Kata is sometimes called form or technique. Kata is another way of thinking of practice. And these concepts are very important. I like the Japanese approach in this particular situation because some of these terms, even though many Japanese sometimes don't even understand what the connections between them, I like the Western approach to those very Japanese concepts because in the West, we try to understand what this all means. And there is a logic behind it because if you think about kata in terms of practice, practice is a form. Well, if you think about it in terms of effectiveness and quality, if your form is good, then your practice is good, your training is good or effective. And if your training and practice and form and kata are good, then your results will be also good. And if not, you can alter the training, form, and kata to augment your results. That's how we approach it in the West. And I think it's a very, very useful way of thinking about it in everyday life, but also in training. Because when you think about training, what you're doing when you're training, in weight training, let's say, you're doing a repetitive action. And this applies to any sports training, really, any physical activity. But if you're training on a regular basis and you're training in weight training, you're doing a repetitive motion. Now, I want to do a disclaimer in this, and I want to apply this to every segment of every show on the show and at theshinseiMethod.com. Before you embark on any physical activity, it's important to talk with a competent medical professional. I always advocate speaking with a competent sports medicine doctor because I've had the best results from them. They seem to know the most about how to train, how you should train to avoid injury. So you can speak with other people. Physical therapists sometimes are quite knowledgeable too. But I like to advocate the sports medicine physicians. You can talk with your regular doctor, but most people go to an internist. And a lot of times internists don't know a lot about the muscular skeletal system and how that applies when you're actually engaged in an activity. So I found the sports medicine doctors, surgeons in particular, are very good, but a lot of times surgeons, their time is limited. So you have to pick and choose based on your current situation, but I would strongly advise you to speak and consult with a sports medicine doctor before you engage on any program and ask them, this is what I'm thinking about doing. Look at certain programs. You can bring programs to them. You can go online, for example, and search out what are good programs for specific things. If you want to build up strength, if you want to build up a total body physical fitness training program, there's many of them out there. I find that yoga is quite good for that. Combining yoga and weight training, I'm finding recently is very, very effective. Of course, I like martial arts and self-defense, with combining that with weight training. There's a lot of different things. I also cycle, so cycling, weight training, there's a lot of combinations you can do, or any of those by themselves as well. I just find that weight training is very good as a supplement to some other activity that you like and enjoy doing. But if you can find a program that you want to work on by your own research and take that program into a sports medicine doctor, that's what I did, and ask them what they think about it, and ask them what they think about ways to avoid injury. A lot of times they'll have very specific knowledge, because a lot of the people that they may operate on or see come because they had injuries, and they can accumulate a lot of knowledge over a long period of time. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, even if you have to pay for a couple of consultations. That's a lot less expensive than surgery. So I'm always an advocate of injury prevention. I did injure myself. I did go through surgery and physical therapy several times. So I know what I'm talking about from a layman's perspective, and I think it's much better in terms of your overall well-being and mental health and your ability to train to avoid injury wherever possible. And you can't do that. If you're in competitive sports, it's a little more difficult, because then you're competing against somebody else. And you can build up your strength, but there's a lot of irregularity and instability of movements in many sports activities, and so it becomes more difficult then to control what you're doing and avoid injury, landing in just the wrong way, or not being able to balance yourself appropriately for a split second, and that sometimes is all it will take. So when you're training in developing a home gym, and you're training in any activity, it's important to establish a routine, a form, a practice. And I like this idea of practice, because through practice you develop a level of what's called shugyo in the martial arts training, in Bushido. That means expertise. Also, I like the term zanshin, which sometimes means the dominating mind, or the expert mind. Expertise is really what it gets to. But you don't get to that expertise and that level of professionalism and ability but through training over a long period of time. Well, look at the principles that requires. That requires discipline, that requires focus, that requires concentration. But most importantly, I found what it also requires is the ability to train in a way that's effective. So you have to know what is effective training, what is good form. Well, one of the reasons that it's very difficult to establish that kind of good or effective training practices and good kato or form or technique is because in America in particular, there's an emphasis on more all the time, intensity in training. Intense training is fine, and it can be effective. I said I trained in competitive powerlifting, and that's one of the most intensive sports that you can imagine, because you're always going for your personal best, and you're really trying to break the level that you're setting by lifting the maximum level of weights. And I always liked that concept, and I still do. Unfortunately, it can lead to injury, so you have to be very careful and cautious in how you train. And one of the most important principles I have found personally in training is gradualism. Training in a slow, controlled manner. Now, maybe if you've been paying attention in this segment of the show, you can see why I talk about all these concepts. I originally talked about, when I was talking about driving, speed is one of the most important ways that you can have in controlling what you're doing, controlling your driving, minimizing risk, minimizing the risk of accident, and also minimizing the ability of having of making a mistake or having trouble. Because especially in driving, you can't control what other people are doing. So speed is an important element. Well, in many fitness training programs, what people are often focusing on is increasing your speed. And you're pushing yourself to increase speed, you're pushing yourself to increase weight, you're pushing yourself to increase time, and etc. These are all effective, and there's nothing wrong with that, because obviously if you, for example, are looking to increase the number of routines you could do in a fixed time period, or you're doing the same routine in a decreased time period, you're going to increase your intensity. And that's an effective way to train sometimes. It's an effective way to build your ability. It's an effective way to strive toward setting specific goals. But it has a place in a training program. And that's one of the things that people don't often highlight in many training programs. They don't talk about putting these things in their proper place. So one of the things that I found that's most important when you're training is training in a way that is gradual, so that you're building toward a specific goal over a period of time. And the reason that I like weight training so much is because with weight training you can start out with very small, very simple weights. One of the things that I found very recently in doing yoga, for example, is when I'm doing yoga, certain yoga techniques, if you're doing a technique where you're using very light weights and you're holding them out. And that's it, just holding the weights out. This is building up your strength in your upper shoulder, your trapezius, your latissimus, a little bit in latissimus dorsi, the trapezius, your deltoids, your triceps, if you hold your arm out in a straight line. All of those muscles are being exercised when you're holding these simple light. This is a 0.5 gram Eleiko weight. And this is all you can do. The reason I like these so well is because they have large holes that you can hold, makes it very easy to hold, and keep your hands flat this way. So I'm just holding the arms or the weights flat this way out to the side. You can also do this to the front too. Now if you hold this out to the front and you start to do exercises like side bends, or you're having this out to the side and you're just doing side bends in a very slow, controlled manner, suddenly you're doing I found a very effective exercise. And you put this exercise into let's say a yoga training program, it can be very effective. That can be just enough for you to train over a period of time, and you build on that. Build on these weights. Of course, you can always add heavier weights, but that's the thing that I wanted to focus on this segment of the show. A lot of times, particularly in weight training, there's always an emphasis on putting more or adding more. Well, I have found that you really don't need to do that with everything. Maybe you just use this, or 1.5 or 2.5 kilograms, something like that, in that range, very limited weight, and just do a light training on one day a week, let's say. Now you may also have a more rigorous weight training program, but maybe not. What I tend to do recently, because I've had some shoulder tendinitis, I have not been doing any shoulder exercises and really no weight training and very limited martial arts training. Mostly what I do when that happens is I train with kicks. And then I have to alternate, because sometimes you train with kicks and maybe your back is bothering me for a while. So then I may focus on just hand exercises, maybe just doing chops or some other striking exercises. But you have to be very careful, I found, with martial arts training in particular. With those kinds of martial arts training, things like jiu-jitsu are a little bit different, but it's very similar, because you're still doing a lot of repetitive. You have to do, when you're talking about form, kata, training, practice, it's repetitive. And if you are repeating a strike over and over again, you are really wearing down the inner muscles, which you don't often see. And those inner muscles, like the rotator cuff, can start to become frayed over a period of time. So I found it's very important to minimize the number of repetitions that you do. And you can do that if you filter in things like visualization. You can visualize certain activities. It's not quite the same, but these are the kinds of things you can do. You can also do very slow movements. This is what I wanted to highlight in this segment of the show. If you're doing an exercise, and this is often sometimes called Tai Chi. People do Tai Chi, but I have found you don't necessarily have to practice Tai Chi. If you want, you can. But you can also do your, whatever the martial arts technique you're engaged in a very slow manner. Sometimes you can do that rather than doing things quick, always with the right amount of speed. One of the things that I trained in a very effective martial arts and self-defense teacher. He's no longer living, unfortunately, but to me he was one of the best. He understood a lot about a lot of different types of martial arts in application to self-defense in particular. I like self-defense because it's much more practical and it builds on other kinds of personal protective capacities. But the principles apply to any martial arts, because what you're talking about is a repetitive motion. And one of the things that he used to highlight in his classes were, don't focus on the speed, let the speed happen naturally. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? When you hear that, it sounds very esoteric. Well, it's not really, if you think about it. And he used to explain it. He wasn't esoteric at all. A lot of times, some teachers do leave it esoteric. What he was trying to say is you focus on the form and allow the comfort and the comfortability that you have with that motion to dictate the speed, and allow that and your comfort level in that activity and your comfort level in the technique. And that comfort level comes with practice, letting your comfort level dictate the speed. And that's how speed happens naturally. Now that is one of the approaches that you have in Mushin and really in developing this idea of Shugyo. But it all comes from practice. And it all also comes from practice, or quality practice, or effective practice. And I have found that quality, effective practice is only possible if you slow it down. If you take the time to build with small weights or small activities or small movements, thinking about it, reflecting on it, acting on it, thinking about it again, and over a period of time you develop this level of technique and ability, and that's really what you're striving toward. You're not really striving toward perfection per se, but that's how perfection is built. You're not looking for perfection. You're just developing a practice that's going to allow you to accomplish a greater and greater efficiency, effectiveness, productivity, ability over a period of time. Do you ever reach the so-called perfection? Of course not. Because you get older, your muscles don't respond in the same way, you're tense, you're tired, you have other things in life. Humans are not perfect, so you never reach perfection. And I feel it's not even necessary to strive toward perfection. What you're striving toward, really, I have found the most effective approach is to strive toward development. And that you can always do at any level. And again, going back to my previous martial arts teacher, allowing that development to happen over a period of time naturally by just training in a way that's effective. How do you do that? By thinking about your training on a regular basis and allowing that to become your approach, become your way of thinking, and to allow that to become your way of existence. And that really is how Mushin, Makoto, Zanshin, Shugyo, intuition, and ability are developed over a period of time, and competence for that matter. Until the next time on the Shinsei Fitness Show, where we talk about everything related to your health, your fitness, your well-being.